Racing in the 1950s and 60s ran on a simple assumption: more cylinders meant more speed, and eventually every serious factory would need 4 of them, or more, just to keep up. Norton believed that too. Their own factory said so out loud when they walked away from a bike that had already won a world championship. But in the privateer paddocks scattered across Europe, that assumption never fully took hold. Riders with no factory contract and no factory budget kept lining up on a single-cylinder engine everyone official had already stopped believing in. And for the next 15 years, that stubbornness kept paying off in ways nobody at the factory saw coming. This is the story of the Norton Manx. Before any of that, it was just a fix, the way most legends start. The Manx grew out of Norton's pre-war International, and after the war, the factory formalized a pure racing version under its own name, starting in 1947, built for one job only, the Isle of Man. Underneath it was a simple air-cooled single, offered in 2 sizes, 350 cubic centimeters in the 40M and 500 cubic centimeters in the 30M. The early engine ran long stroke, 79.62 by 100 millimeters, built for torque. By the early 1950s, Norton reworked it short stroke, 86 by 85.6 millimeters, so it could spin higher and chase down the multi-cylinder bikes it was increasingly racing against. Then, in 1950, came the piece that actually made the Manx dangerous. A new frame designed by the McCandless brothers in Belfast, all-welded, twin down tube, so far ahead of anything else on a grid that riders called it the featherbed on first set. A single-cylinder engine that was, on paper, already behind the competition suddenly had a chassis good enough to make that not matter. Under works manager Joe Craig, that combination did exactly what it was built to do. Jeff Duke took the 500cc World Championship in 1951 on a factory Manx. Isle of Man TT wins piled up in both classes through the rest of the decade. By the middle of the 50s, the Manx was not just competitive, it was the benchmark single of its era. The bike every privateer in Europe wanted parked in his own garage. That is the machine Norton was sitting on when the decision came. In 1953, Norton was bought by Associated Motorcycles, a larger group that already owned Matchless and AJS. Within a year of that purchase, the works team that had built the Manx's reputation was gone. At the end of 1954, Norton withdrew its factory Grand Prix effort entirely, rising costs, softening sales, and a grid that had moved on to multi-cylinder machines from Gilera and soon after MV Agusta. Norton's new ownership decided that fight was not worth paying for anymore. Here is what makes that withdrawal more than a budget decision. Norton was not just stopping, it was canceling a bike still on the drawing board. The F-Type, the planned next-generation Manx, with a horizontal cylinder, a 5-speed gearbox, and further chassis work beyond even the featherbed, got shelved along with the racing program. Norton did not walk away from an old design because it had run out of ideas for a new one. It walked away from the new one too. Joe Craig retired that same year, closing out more than 25 years spent developing Norton's single-cylinder racers at the exact moment the factory stopped needing what he had spent that career building. What Norton kept afterward was smaller than what it gave up. No works team, no Grand Prix budget, no F-Type. Just a limited run of customer Manx machines, built for privateers willing to keep racing a bike the factory itself had stopped believing in. That arrangement held for about 8 years. Then it ended too, and this time there was no partial version of the decision left to make. 1962 was the last full production year at Norton's historic Bracebridge Street works in Birmingham. AMC decided to close the factory outright and move whatever remained of Norton production to Woolwich in London. What followed was not a handover. It was a liquidation. Somewhere between November of 1962 and January of 1963, workers assembled a final batch of roughly 42 Manx machines, built largely from whatever parts were left in the stores. 42 motorcycles is not a production run. It is a factory using up its own leftovers before the lights went off. 3 things converged to end it. AMC's finances were deteriorating, and the group's attention had shifted to road-going twins, the bikes that actually moved volume in showrooms. Lucas, the supplier of the Manx's magneto ignition, announced it would stop making the part. and converting the design to a different ignition system was judged too expensive for a model already being wound down, and underneath both of those sat the real decision that AMC had chosen to exit pure racing motorcycles as a category and put its money elsewhere. The Manx was not killed by one problem. It was killed by a company that had already decided the problem was not worth solving. What happened to what was left tells you exactly how little the factory valued it by then. The remaining spares and tooling were sold off, first to racer and frame builder Colin Seeley in 1966, then on to John Tickle in 1969. Tickle kept building a limited number of Manx-based racers, the T3 in 350cc form and the T5 in 500 for a few more years after that. The bike that once carried a factory team to a world championship ended up as spare parts changing hands between individuals because the company that built it had moved on twice and had nothing left to say about what happened to it next. Here is the part the factory does not get credit for, because the factory was not in the room for it. Even after the works withdrawal in 1954, the Manx did not fade off the grid. It became the backbone of the Continental Circus, the loose community of privateer racers who traveled from race to race across Europe, funding themselves off start money and prize money with no factory support behind any of them. Through the rest of the 50s and into the 60s, if you wanted to race competitively as an independent rider, the Manx was very often the only real option. In the 1960 Senior TT, 55 of the 81 starters were riding Manx 500s. That is not a niche machine holding on at the back of a grid. That is a design the factory had already stopped developing, still making up 2/3 of the field, 6 years after Norton stopped racing it. And privateers kept extracting results out of it long after any reasonable person would have expected the design to be finished. Jack Ahern finished second in the 1964 500cc World Championship on Manx machinery. Dick Creith won the 1965 Ulster Grand Prix outright on one. These were not nostalgia rides. These were competitive results against factory-backed multi-cylinder opposition on a chassis and engine combination. Norton itself had decided was not worth investing in a decade earlier, which brings us to 1969, and the year that actually closes this story. Godfrey Nash won the Yugoslavian Grand Prix that year, run at the Opatija circuit on the Adriatic coast, riding a Norton Manx. That win is recorded as the last 500 cubic centimeters Grand Prix victory ever achieved by a single-cylinder motorcycle. Not the last Norton win, the last time any single-cylinder machine has beaten the field at that level, full stop, in more than 50 years since. There is context worth being honest about. Giacomo Agostini and the MV Agusta factory team did not contest that particular race, because the championship was already decided by that point in the season. That fact does not erase what happened. Nash still finished third overall in the full 1969 500cc World Championship on a bike whose factory had abandoned works racing 15 years earlier and had stopped building the thing entirely 7 years before that. By 1969, Norton had nothing left to do with the Manx, no factory team, no production line, no engineering department behind it. Whatever credit exists for what that motorcycle achieved in its final competitive year belongs entirely to the privateer community that kept racing it after the company that built it had walked away twice. So look at the actual sequence, because it is the whole argument. Norton built the benchmark racing single of its era, then quit racing it in 1954 while a next generation replacement sat cancelled on the drawing board. It kept building a reduced version for 8 more years, then quit that too in 1962, closing the factory that made it and selling off the leftover parts to whoever would take them. By every decision the company itself made, the Manx was finished twice over by the middle of the 60s. Nobody told the privateers, they kept buying it, kept racing it, and in 1969, on a circuit the factory team was not even at, one of them won a Grand Prix outright on a design Norton had given up on twice. That result still stands as the last of its kind, more than half a century later.
The company that built the Norton Manx did not get to decide when it was finished. The people who kept racing it did. Somewhere out there is a rider who raced a privateer Manx after Norton had already walked away from it twice, or owns one now. If that is you, tell me what kept you racing a bike your own factory had given up on. I will read everyone.